Well, thank you, and I feel it's a privilege for me to teach the book of Ecclesiastes. Several of you have mentioned to me how it's one of your favorite books in the Bible, and it's a favorite of mine too. But if you're not familiar with the book, it's one of those books in the Bible that is super confusing at first until you understand what the writer is getting at. And what the book is, the title is Ecclesiastes, and it comes from a Greek word, ecclesia, which is a church gathering. And what the writer is doing is he's talking to God's people, and he's going to ask them some hard questions that are going to make them very uncomfortable. It's not a book that's designed to make you feel good. It's a book that's designed to make you think deep. And that is what is going to happen here. And if you're not familiar with it, let me just tell you two stories that will give you a bit of a feel for what this book is going to be about. First story is of a couple that was driving one day with their kids, and as they're going down the highway, one of the kids does what little kids do, and they said, "Mommy, I got to go pee," and "Mommy, I got to go right now," and it was an emergency pit stop at the quickest gas station they could get to. After the child had their little pee break, they got back on the highway, and they went about a mile, and there was this huge accident. And what they realized is if they hadn't had that emergency pit stop, they would have been in that accident. And you can imagine those people going, "Wow, isn't God good? He protected us. He is so faithful to care for his children." And they told their friends, and the next week at church, they were sharing with everybody about God's goodness. And many of you have had experiences like that. But what that couple didn't realize is that the car ahead of them was also a car that had a Christian family. It was a mother and dad and their 4 children, and they were heading on a vacation. And that morning, as they sat in their van in the driveway, they all prayed together that God would protect them and bless them on this vacation time. They were the car that got in the accident, and the 4 children were all killed. Now, they didn't go to church the next Sunday and say, "Isn't God great?" That event forced them to ask some very hard questions about God and about their faith. And what you find in life is when you're in a society where everything's going well, it's peaceful, it's prosperous, we tend to go into more shallow thinking, and it's the pain times that break through any lies we might have started to believe and get us to ask those very important but very difficult questions. The second story I wanted to tell you is a story from my life, and I have many times in my teens and 20s where I saw God graciously provide financially for me. And I could go on, but I'll tell you one story. It was just before I started university. I'd finished Bible college, and I had to get a job for the summer in order to get enough money to go to university. And a fellow in our community was a builder, and he said he'd take me on to work for him for the summer. And one day, he had asked me at the end of the day if I would do a certain job, which I knew was illegal. And I said, "I don't think I can do that." And he said, "Well, you're fired." So I went home, and I had the house all to myself. My mom and dad were away. And I said, "God, how am I going to pay for my tuition?" And I sat there and just prayed, and then the phone rang. And it was my uncle, and I had never talked to my uncle on the phone before. He owned a construction company in a city about an hour and a half away. And he said, "Tim, I don't know if you're the right guy, but we're on a great big building project, and I just had a guy quit on me, and I desperately need somebody to come and work for me. Is there any chance you're looking for work?" And then he said, "And here's what I'll offer to pay you." And it was twice as much as I was making with the other guy. Now, I just was in awe at God's provision and God's faithfulness. But there's another person that I know very well who came out of addiction, and they gave their life to the Lord. They were sold out for God. They were passionate for God to make a difference in this world for God, but they were also an entrepreneur, and they had a business idea. And they floated the idea amongst a bunch of friends, and they all said, great idea, it's a great product, nobody else is doing this, this should really take off. And so the young guy invested all of his money, all of his savings into getting this new business off the ground. He had trouble getting it going, so he got his father to invest over $1 million into getting this business off the ground. And after a year of trying to get it going, it failed, and he lost everything. Had to declare bankruptcy. Now, he didn't go to church and say, isn't God wonderful? How he provides. You want to know what his dad said to me? He says, I don't understand why God would let this happen. This man was so sold out for God and wanted to make a difference. Why didn't God bless him with success in this business venture? They were asking some hard questions. And what I have come to in a place in my life, and I hope you have too, is I don't want to get to a place in my life where my faith doesn't handle the hard questions. I want a faith that does provide a solution to those times of pain. And that's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is about. And he's going to go in two different directions in challenging two different things and asking hard questions to two different things. First, he's going to do it to culture. And the culture at that time would be much like ours, prosperous, peaceful. And what does a culture that is prosperous and peaceful do? Without even realizing it, they begin to tell people in the culture lies about how to be happy. What does our culture say? If you want to be happy, what you need is lots of money and lots of entertainment and lots of fun and lots of sex. And then you'll be happy. Just indulge all of your desires. And the writer says, is that really true? And he forces them to challenge the beliefs of culture. But then he goes on, and he doesn't just stop at culture, he turns to the church, and he realizes that churches can often, without realizing it, begin to have a distorted message that isn't totally true. And he wants to challenge that. Think of it this way. If you're a Christian, you want to be a salesman for Jesus. And you want to sell Jesus to other people. And so to be a salesman, you got to look at the benefits of your product. And you want to sell the product and give the customer all the benefits of this product and why it's better than other products. And so the danger is that you oversell the product. You promise more than the product actually was designed to deliver. And so what happens, I think, for a lot of Christians who have a bit of an inferiority complex, they go to our culture and they're kind of I got to sell Jesus to them. And so they say, you know what, if you trust Jesus, he'll fix all your problems. He'll take your addiction away. You won't struggle anymore. He'll fix your mental health. He'll straighten your kids out. And people say, sign me up. And then they follow Jesus and their addiction doesn't go away. Their kids are still messed up. And they go, I don't like this new religion that's been presented to me. I think they lied to me. And so the writer says, let's challenge our faith, because a faith that cannot be challenged from every culture and every painful place is not a faith worth having. And so that is the book of Ecclesiastes. Hard questions that make you think and that can be uncomfortable. Now, I want to start as if you knew nothing about this book on verse 1. And I want to read the first little bit and give you a feel for it. And as I read it, you're going to go, this sounds like a grumpy old man having a bad day writing. Because here's what he says. I, the teacher, was king of Israel, and I lived in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to search for understanding and to explore by wisdom everything being done under heaven. I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really, it's all meaningless, like the chasing of wind. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come, generations go, the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. Now, if a person's really struggling, that might not be the passage you get them to get a pick-me-up from. And you go, what's up with this guy? That is like depression stuff. Well, let me read you a few things because it just keeps going. So these are going into further chapters. All people spend their lives scratching for food, but they never seem to have enough. So you go to your job and you just always seem to be scratching out an existence. So are wise people really better than fools? And what he's saying is, why go through all the work to learn stuff and get a degree when you're scratching out a living just as much as the dumb guy next door? What's the benefit of being smart? Do poor people gain anything being wise and knowing how to act in front of others? What's the point of all the hard work? And then this one, he's talking about a culture where people are living, being oppressed by an abusive government. So life is not fair. Life is very difficult. It's unjust. There's a lot of pain. I observed all the oppression that takes place under the sun. The oppressors have great power, and their victims are helpless. So I concluded that the dead are better off than the living. Well, whoopee. But then he says this, but most fortunate of all are those who are not yet born, or you could translate it, those that were stillborn. And so what he is saying is, in an oppressive culture where you live in pain and injustice and constant bad things happening to good people, maybe the best person is the little baby that was stillborn. Now, you don't go up to a couple that just had a stillborn and say, read book of Ecclesiastes, your kid is fortunate, you should be thankful. So what is going on here? Well, there's two key words that I want you to understand that help you begin to make sense of this. The first word comes in the first chapter a lot, and it's repeated throughout the book, and you heard it as I read it. It's meaningless. And the word actually in Hebrew refers to a vapor or to smoke. And there's two different ideas that come with this vapor or smoke. The first is, if you look at a vapor, it comes and then it quickly vanishes. And he could be saying, life in our lives, in the big picture of history, is like a little vapor that comes on the scene and then we're gone. So life is a fleeting thing. But there's a second thing that I think he's saying, and it's this. If you look at smoke, when you first see it, it looks like a solid. It's gray. It looks real. It looks like you can go and touch it and hang on to it and grab it. But when you do that, you go through air. There's nothing there. And what he's saying is, you might think you found something that you can latch onto that's going to make you happy. And you go and you latch onto that, and it's not there. It's not real. And you end up in this empty, meaningless life. Now, to really make sense of it, the key word, the key phrase, which is used 27 times, is under the sun. So here's the big picture of the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon, the writer, who is the wisest man in the world, he says, I want to see if human beings can find happiness under the sun. And what he means is, can they find happiness without a God or without a spiritual dimension? Can they find happiness just within the horizontal plane of our physical world without a vertical connection to a spiritual world? I want to explore that. And so I'm going to use all my wisdom to check out every possible way of finding happiness. And I am going to explore that, and then because he was the wealthiest person in the world. He says, I can take everything that gives pleasure and explore it to the full end and just indulge myself in every possible pleasure because I've got lots of money to do that. And so that's his quest. He is going to look for happiness just in this world alone. Now think of our culture today. If you were to go to our culture today and you were to say to them, can you find happiness just living in Canada if there was no God or no spiritual dimension? Our culture would say, yes. We have the toys, we have the technology, we have the events, we have the entertainment that we will make you have a satisfying life. And Solomon says, I want to challenge that. Is that really true? And so his quest then, beginning in chapter 2, he begins to investigate 10 different pleasure-giving things. And he is going to say, if I just indulge myself totally in this pleasure, will it make me satisfied and happy? So he begins, I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found that this too was meaningless. I could take you to hundreds of people that I work with that made a pursuit in their life of chasing pleasure with no God and no spiritual. And at first it looked like it was going to keep them happy. At first it looked like, wow, I found the solution to life. But as long as they just pursued that pleasure, it gradually started to get boring. And it left them feeling empty. It left them with the conclusion that Solomon said, meaningless. It's a vapor, it's smoke. You grab onto it, but it's not really there. And then he says, I'm going to try laughter. Now, we love laughter because when we laugh, we feel warm feelings. It picks us up. It encourages us. So we love listening to funny stories, watching comedies on TV, listening to comedians. Laughter is good for the soul. But if you just put all your eggs in laughter basket and you just tried to laugh constantly, would that make you satisfied? Solomon says, no. What good does it do? It leaves you empty. You become bored of laughter after a while. Then he goes, after much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine, alcohol. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people find during their brief life in this world. What he's saying is this: the people that look into wine as the way to be happy are people who haven't had a happy life. And they're clutching on this thing that finally gives them positive emotions. They have lived a life where most of their emotions are painful, empty, negative. And now they find alcohol and they say, for the first time, I feel happiness and pleasure. This is a solution. And they pursue that. And what does Solomon say? They end up saying, this is meaningless. It doesn't satisfy. It leaves me empty. And then I'm going to build and find meaning in building huge homes for myself, planting beautiful vineyards, made gardens and parks, filling them with all kinds of fruit trees. Our culture, let's get a bigger house, a bigger yard, the best landscaping. Surely then we'll be happy. Solomon says, nope. Then I'm going to get a prosperous business. I bought slaves. I owned large herds and flocks, more than any other of the kings who had lived in Jerusalem before me. If I can have a successful business where I get lots of money and where I get a position of power and respect and influence, surely then I will be happy. Solomon says, no. Okay, I'm going to collect lots of sums of silver and gold, the treasure of many kings and provinces. And Solomon became the wealthiest man in the world when he was alive. Did that bring happiness? No. Okay, entertainment. I'm going to hire singers. And we have movies today. We have TV. We have entertainment in every shape, form you could think of. And if you just pursue entertainment, will that make your life satisfying? No. And Solomon says, okay, sex. Sex is the most pleasurable gift that God has given to human beings. You want to know what Solomon did? He had 700 wives and 300 mistresses, 1,000 women. I can't even get my head around that. And here's what he said: I had many beautiful concubines. I had everything a man could desire. We live in a culture today that is putting more and more eggs in the basket of sex as the answer to happiness. And Solomon says, I checked it out. I had 1,000. It didn't leave me satisfied. And so, how about self-indulgence? Total self-indulgence. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. Did that make him happy? No. And then he adds one more. I'm going to become a workaholic. I am going to work like crazy and make a difference in this world. Did that satisfy? No. And so here's what he says at the end of these 10 things he tried. As I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless. Like chasing after the wind, there was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. That is, when you ask hard questions of our culture today, a culture that promises happiness, and you ask hard questions, you end up with the same conclusion. You're not going to find it in a horizontal dimension only. The starting point for true happiness has to be a vertical dimension. And that is what Solomon is trying to drive home to his people. But then he doesn't want to stop just at culture. He now turns to the church, to Christians. This book of Ecclesiastes is in a part of the Bible that we call the wisdom literature. It includes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Job. The wisdom literature was actually a term in that culture that carried a lot of meaning and made a lot of sense to the first readers. So let me explain it to you. What the people in that culture did is what we would do at university with all of the different branches of education. They wanted to find out how everything worked in society. So if a person was a farmer, they would want to say, with this type of seed, you plant it in this type of soil, and you make sure it gets this amount of water, and this amount of fertilizer, and this amount of sunlight. And then if you do all of that, A, B, C, and D, then you will get a good crop. That was called the wisdom literature, figuring out everything in life. So they would then go to parents and say, if you want to have kids that turn out, do this, this, and this, and kids would turn out. If you're starting a business, do this, this, and this. And that was the wisdom literature. And it wasn't just Christian or spiritual or philosophical. It covered every area of life. What was happening at the time that the writer wrote? And so we believe that Solomon didn't write the book. There was a different person that wrote about Solomon's teaching. And when he wrote, Israel was in captivity. So just up to that time, Israel had been going through a time of prosperity, great time, where if we did A, B, C, and D, this always happened. If we did these things, God blessed us. Life was good. And then an army came in and carried them away captive. They saw friends and family killed. They were mistreated. They were in poverty, all kinds of hardships. And they're going, we're still doing A, B, C, and D, but why aren't we getting the result? And they were asking the hard questions. And so that's what he's dealing with now. Now, here's the danger when you do wisdom, is that in a prosperous culture, it looks like A, B, C equals D is constantly true. And so you begin to think, I can control my life. In fact, I can even control God. If I do this, this, and this, then God will bless me. And you get that in your head. Now, let me just give you a modern example. Every week, I work with clients at React, and what I am doing is working with people who come out of trauma and addiction, whose lives are messed up in a big way. I say there's a way to get healthy, and that is you live a healthy life, and I define healthy life by living within God's design. So God has given us the gift of food. You can use food in the way God designed food to be used, or you can step outside of that design, and guess what? You're going to have painful consequences. But if you live within God's design in every area of life, you will find blessings. You will find positive things begin to happen. I can say that truly. And clients experience it. And they get all excited because good things start happening as they live within that narrow pathway of God's design. But let's say one of those clients really got pumped up and he was following God, and all of a sudden his business took off and he became quite wealthy. And he went to his friends who were messed up and he said, if you will walk in this narrow path of healthy, you will become rich. He just took it to a way to control God. Back in 1990, the Soviet communism just fell. The Berlin Wall came down. And all of a sudden, this whole world that the communists had ruled with ruthless tyranny was gone. What happened in 1990 is all these Christian preachers from the West rushed to Russia in order to start preaching. And so some prosperity theology preachers began to go and preach in Russia. And they said, if you follow God and trust God, he'll make you wealthy. You want to know what the Russian Christians did? They spit on those preachers. And they said this, if you came here 10 years ago with your message when we were under the domination of communism, where we were being persecuted for our faith, where we were being fired from jobs and living in poverty with no money at all because of our faith, and you were to come back 10 years ago, it would have proven what you're teaching is a lie, because it wouldn't have worked in a communist regime. So if it doesn't work in a communist regime, I'm not going to believe it now just because culture has changed. Something is flawed in what you're teaching. And so what the writer of Ecclesiastes wants us to understand is we live inside of God's design for healthy, and we will get many, many blessings, but that does not mean we won't get pain. We can't live within God's design and expect an easy life. We can expect blessing, but we can also expect heartache and great difficulty. And so walking within God's design, do you realize that for some people to follow God's design, they actually end up experiencing more pain than people outside in the world who aren't following God's design? And so Solomon is saying, folks, do not reduce God to a box. Do not try to think you can develop a formula for life that you can control, because it's not true. And so then you go, what do we do? If we can't control God, where do we go? And he gives us 5 things, and I'll give them very quickly. Number 1, he says, enjoy God's gifts. Now, here's the balance. He says, understand that you can't find happiness just in God's gifts without a God. You need to enjoy God's gifts, but enjoy the giver even more. And if you develop a life of connection to God, he doesn't want you to never have fun or never do pleasurable things. He wants you to enjoy the gifts that he's given us. So get your relationship with God first, and then enjoy the wonderful things that he's given us. Secondly, if you're accepting the fact that you can't control God or you can't control life, that means you got to learn to trust. You got to develop a posture of heart that lives in deep dependence on God. And what he's saying this, following God doesn't make life easy. Following God might make life painful, but if you get to really know God, you will find that even in the painful valleys, He's with you, and he will take the painful stuff and turn it into good in your life if you will trust him. So that one day you'll be thankful that you trusted God. And then thirdly, justice comes one day. The reason we go through so much pain and heartache is often because people living outside of God's design who aren't experiencing justice steal from us, hurt us, shoot people, rape people. Don't let that turn you off of God. God's going to sort it all out someday. He's just letting humans do their thing now without interfering, but justice will come someday. And then fourthly, he says, understand that life has seasons. Following God doesn't mean that life is constantly pleasant, positive, nice emotions. Life is pain and happiness, sorrow and joy. It is positive and negative. And he gives this lengthy quote, but many of you have heard it. Everything, there is a season, a time for everything under heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. A time to plant and a time to harvest. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to cry and a time to laugh. A time to grieve and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to turn away. A time to search and a time to quit searching. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be quiet and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Even following God means we go through seasons. It's not always the same. And finally, he gives an appeal. It's directed to young people. And he realizes that many young people will say, I'll follow God one day, but right now I want to have fun. And he wants them to think about that, and he's challenging them. And he says, don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. Honor him in your youth before you grow old and say, life is not pleasant anymore. He says, you can go try to have your fun, but you want to know what's going to happen when you get older? You're going to have a lot of regrets about wasted years. If you get your heart right with God, and he says, remember your Creator now, while you are young. Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commands. What he is saying is this, and this is the essence of his message. If you want happiness, the starting point is fearing God. Now, that doesn't mean be afraid of God. Fearing God was a term used in the Hebrew culture that meant put more value in God than anything else in your life. Treasure him, desire him, pursue him, want to be like him. That his advice carries more weight in your thinking than anybody else's advice. That he becomes the key, supreme person in your heart. You get that right, and then the rest follows. But it starts at that spiritual core of connection to God. Let's pray. Father, what a necessary book, somewhat shocking, uncomfortable book. But I just pray for any here today who've been trying to find happiness in all the wrong places, that they would come home to you and they would find the joy of life with you. Amen.